We're trying to include her.
Welcome, everybody. We will get going in just a minute. We just have some other people hopping on, but we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, so it should all sound come through here.
Hey, everybody, we still have some people jumping on. We'll get started here in just a second. Will one of the SCORE staff please verify you can see the slides?
Yep, we can see it.
We can see them.
Thank you. Still got quite a number of people jumping on, so we'll just give it just another minute or two. I appreciate everybody's patience. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We'll likely have some more people jumping on throughout the afternoon, but welcome everybody to this last of the rollout events for the statewide resilience plan. We've been doing a statewide tour of in-person meetings, but we're happy to be able to make this this virtual option available to folks that weren't able to attend in person and want to learn more about our office and the resilience plan that was just released. For those that may not be familiar, our office, the Office of Resilience, exists to lessen the impact of disasters on the communities and citizens of South Carolina by planning and coordinating statewide resilience, long-term recovery, and hazard mitigation. A brief history of our office. Our office was formed as the Disaster Recovery Office following the floods of 2015. Governor Haley at the time pulled together a couple of members from each cabinet agency and formed the Disaster Recovery Office. Just as that office was getting started, we were followed up with Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence hit our state again. So we had three presidentially declared disasters in a very short period of time. As a result, Governor McMaster established in 2018 the Floodwater Commission headed by Tom Mulliken. And one of the recommendations of that commission was that there needed to be a standalone office for the state to look at these sorts of issues and be proactive in our planning. And as a result of that, in 2020, the legislature signed and the governor, the legislature passed and the governor signed the Disaster Relief and Resilience Act, which created our office, and we received funding to begin operations and start of fiscal year 2022. So we're still a relatively new state office, a little over 2 years with funding, but we've been very active. What do? We do three major things, three major activities. We do disaster recovery, focus on the long-term recovery of rebuilding and replacing homes that were impacted by hurricanes and other disasters. We do that through HUD CBDG-DR funding. We also do mitigation programs. We do buyouts, infrastructure projects, plans and studies, and matching grants for local communities. We do that through a HUD CBDG MIT grant. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. And then our resilience planning side of things, we developed the first strategic statewide resilience and risk reduction plan, really focusing on trying to be proactive in our planning efforts. We also have two funds that we manage along with that came along with the creation of our office. If you see the graphic on the right there, if you think about the disaster cycle and where our office is active, we're really focused on that long-term recovery, mitigation, and long-term planning and preparedness portion of the cycle. Our emergency management division does an excellent job of immediate preparedness and immediate response. They also have mitigation activities as well, and we work well together with them. But our agency is particularly focused on those kind of long-term issues. Our disaster recovery office, we've prepared or replaced over 3,300 homes through our 3 grant programs. You can see the counties we've operated in here on the maps. We've closed out the 2015 grant. That's been completed, over 1,800 homes completed in that. We finished construction on our 2016 Hurricane Matthew grant, over 1,100 homes completed in that program. And we're well on our way to completing our Hurricane Florence grant. Over 420 homes have been completed in that program. So over 3,300 homes through those 3 different programs, helping people recover from disasters. And when we're talking about what that looks like, we can look at pictures like this. The home on the left, there were folks still living in that home when our office showed up. Well after a disaster had happened, we were able to come in and using the HUD funds at no cost to that resident, be able to build them a new home, as you see there on the right. So that's the kind of situation we're dealing with. We're dealing with the folks that need it the most. They need help the most. And we're very proud of the fact that almost 100% of our funds have gone to those folks that are deemed low to moderate income. In addition to our disaster recovery operations, we also have a mitigation grant program that was funded through a $162 million grant from HUD. Operates in a 17-county area. You see the counties highlighted there in the map. These are those counties that were hit multiple times through the repeat disasters. And really, through this program, we're focusing on 4 different types of activities, infrastructure projects. This can be green or gray infrastructure to help alleviate flooding issues. Buyouts to remove folks from harm's way and restore that space to green space to allow the water to go where it needs to go. Plans and studies, these programs are in place to help communities understand why they have issues and to develop projects to solve those issues. And then the matching grants program was available to help be that local cost share portion for federal flood mitigation grants. Just a couple of examples of the types of projects. The largest one we've been working on is in the Earhart Tunnel in the Charleston Medical District. For those that are familiar, the Charleston Medical District experiences repeat flooding. It's in a low-lying area. And this is a project to help tunnel some of that water deep underground so it can be then pumped out during periods of low tide. But this project, we contributed $10 million to part of a larger project ongoing in the city of Charleston. And this will help alleviate some of that flooding in the medical district. We also do home buyouts. We've done some buyouts across the state. The largest one we've been working on is in Horry County. right along the Intercoastal Waterway in Socastee area. These were slab-on-grade homes in a low-lying area right next to the Intercoastal Waterway. And really, these folks were just experiencing a lot of repetitive flooding. So we're able to go in and offer buyouts to these folks to get them out of harm's way and return that area to green space. But what we're going to spend most of the time today talking about is the new resilience plan that was just released at the end of June. This plan is intended to serve as a guide for how local governments can implement resilience into their communities, and also to guide how the state handles these resilience issues. It's broken up on our website. You can go and check it out. It's 9 separate chapters that are broken up, so they're a little bit more manageable. It's quite an extensive document. But we've broken up into chapters, and we'll review those chapters kind of today in order, just a brief overview of those. The first chapter is the introduction chapter. Talks a lot about our office history, our enabling legislation, some key things that we were tasked to do by the legislature. We were tasked with developing this plan in accordance with the principles in the Floodwater Commission. And just a few of those principles identified here is that plans and actions need to be based on watershed boundaries. Data and models need to be transparent and freely accessible to all stakeholders. Building the capacity of local governments to develop science-based and actionable flood management plans is a priority. And then the success depends upon collaboration. There's a lot of good work that's already been happening in the resilience and disaster recovery space. We really need to collaborate with the folks that are already doing this work just to maximize the impact we can have statewide. In addition, there needs to be ongoing opportunities for public participation and education. That's part of this series here, rolling out the initial version of the plan, trying to educate folks on the plan and what's in it. We'll be expanding this as we continue with our planning process. The planning process never ends, so we'll be continually trying to engage the public. Our flood management programs need to recognize the beneficial functions of natural systems. This can be floodplains, beach dunes, areas of good infiltration, and also recognize that in addition to flood protection benefits, there are benefits, co-benefits for South Carolinians for recreation, forestry, tourism, and wildlife. And then finally, that post-disaster funding that is coming into South Carolina from congressional appropriations needs to be managed in a unified state plan. There's a lot of different federal dollars that can flow through after disaster. And as much as possible, we need to coordinate that under a unified plan. Some assumptions that we made when we began this planning process. The first is that we do have to look at what the future climate is going to look like. But this is not a plan to try to solve for climate. We're not looking at greenhouse gas reductions in this plan. We're simply trying to look at what do the future conditions look like and how do we adapt for that. We use an adaptive management approach. We recognize that we're going to be continuously getting new data and information in, and we'll need to adapt this plan as that information becomes available. And then the first version of this plan really does focus on flooding. We are an all hazards agency, but this first version of the plan focuses on flooding, and we'll be expanding our look at other extreme weather events and disasters through future versions of the plan. Just want to recognize the many groups that participated in the planning process. You can see a lot of the organizations listed here. We had a very high number of folks that engaged with us during the planning process, a very intense meeting schedule over about an 18-month period. But all these folks dedicated their time to help shape and develop the plan, and we certainly appreciate that. The first thing we really did with the resilience planning process was define what we were talking about when we were talking about resilience. We were given an Office of Resilience. We were tasked with developing a resilience plan, but we were not given a definition of what resilience meant. So that was the first thing we took on, was come up with a definition, and we define it as the ability of communities, economies, and ecosystems within South Carolina to anticipate, absorb, recover, and thrive when presented with environmental change and natural hazards. And so if you think about this graphically, you can look at the graph on the left, and you can think about system function over time. It could be any system. Let's just use a stormwater system, for example. But you have a certain system function, and then over time, you have downward pressures from environmental change or deferred maintenance. So your system function starts to decline. You have some acute event, some natural hazard, that system will likely collapse. And then it'll kind of function at a low level for a long period of time until we start to have that federal response, which can take quite some time. That federal, local, and state response can take some time to get going. And then it's kind of a slow recovery. And there's always more need than there are resources. So you never really recover back to your original function. And then meanwhile, you've got these continual downward environmental pressures that are happening. So your system continues to decline long term. What we want to do is we want to develop more resilient systems. And that's where we're anticipating what's coming. We're thinking about those downward environmental pressures and those natural hazards. So we're continuously improving our systems over time, thinking about things like funding maintenance on systems and making sure they're functioning at peak performance. They're able to absorb hazards better. If we're designing them to absorb potential impacts, they'll be able to handle those events better. There's likely still going to be some system decline, but it won't be as much. And then really, if we can coordinate state, federal, and local responses better and utilize our funds that were set up with the creation of our office, we can kind of kickstart recovery and make that recovery time much shorter. And ultimately, that is a good time to make changes to your system where we can make changes that help us thrive long term and be able to face, again, those increasing environmental pressures over time. And so I like to think about things graphically, and I'm no graphic artist, so everybody bear with my stick figures here. But you know, the way I like to think about this is you start off and you have a house, you know, next to a river. It's a sunny day. You know, life is good. Everybody is happy. We have rain events. That system functions largely like it should. The rain falls down. Large portions of that water is evapotranspirated off by the vegetation. Some of that water is going to run off the surface and into our floodplains, and you can see how the flood waters have risen in the floodplain, but our house is still nice and dry. And a large portion of that water is infiltrating into the soils and then able to, you know, seep into our slower groundwater systems. You know, over time, what happens is maybe we have some unplanned development, we have some land use change, we add a lot of impervious surface to the system. And so what happens now is we have our rainfall events, more of that water is running off. You see, we put a housing development in a low-lying area. That housing development is now flooding. Our original house is still dry, but you can notice that the floodwaters have gotten closer. That floodplain has expanded as we've increased the amount of rainfall that goes to runoff. And then, so that's where we typically come in and maybe put in a pipe system to help drain some of that water from the area that's experiencing flooding. So we've gone in now, we've put in a stormwater pipe to help drain that water. So we've solved one problem over here in our low-lying area, but we just moved it downstream and caused the expansion of the floodplain into our original housing area. So now we've just kind of moved the problem from one area to the other. And then over time, our rainfall is getting more intense. So we're getting more rainfall. We have what's been referred to as basketball flooding, where, you know, storm pipes get clogged up with basketballs or other vegetative debris, so they don't function at their peak capacity. And what ends up happening is now we have multiple areas that are experiencing flooding due to the choices we've made. And that's maybe where we have typically come in and done some traditional mitigation type activities. Maybe we expand the size of the pipe, maybe we make a bigger pipe, maybe we add some nature-based features, bioswales, vegetation, that sort of thing. Maybe we come in and do some housing elevations to get the original house up above the floodwaters. And we kind of solve the problem, but you can kind of see our guy from the original house is still stranded on top of this house during a flood event, because while he is elevated, he's isolated and not able to get services. So, and it's all very expensive, right? We've spent a lot of money into infrastructure and housing retrofits to deal with these issues. So it's a very expensive proposition to deal with flooding issues this way. And so what we want to do is we want to think about this differently. And here's my planning team. I have a great team of folks that work on this. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to think about what do those future conditions look like. And we're trying to do this during sunny period time. So it's not a reaction to something. We're trying to do this ahead of time. So we want to think about, what's our landscape? What do those future conditions look like? What money is available to implement plans and that sort of thing? And we're doing that all on the front end. Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to design our systems to be more like this. Here we've got all the same stuff. We have the same amount of commercial activity. We have the same amount of housing stock. We've just kind of designed it differently. We've moved where the housing locations are. We've incorporated some nature-based features into their design. We've incorporated things like permeable pavements into our commercial areas. In that low-lying area that experiences flooding, maybe we put in some sort of passive park where it can handle the flood waters and be an asset to the community, but not put anybody in harm's way. So it's just kind of a more forward-thinking way of designing things, and we're able to handle those future conditions and really thrive. The real-world example I'd like to point out here is Charleston. We're looking at a historical map of the Charleston Peninsula. You can see the blue areas with the street map overlay. Those blue areas were tidal zones. So those were areas that were previously affected by tides. They were backfilled with all sorts of debris, garbage, mud, and then built upon. And really the peninsula has developed onto those landfill areas. And what's happened is, if you look at a flood map, this is using data from the First Street Foundation, which I'll talk more about in a second. But what we see is that those areas that are most prone to flooding are those exact same areas where we've gone in and backfilled. So they're those low-lying areas where water wants to go, but because we made the decision decades ago to build on there, we're now faced with having flooding issues largely in those areas. And as a result, we have to consider, very expensive projects. So the tunneling project I've already mentioned, certainly very expensive project. There's the consideration of whether you build a sea barrier around the peninsula or not in order to help alleviate some of these flooding issues. But these are all decisions that are necessary now because of the decisions that were made decades ago. And that's really the takeaway from resilience, is we need to be thinking long-term for how we're developing as the state grows. The next chapter of the plan really focuses on how do we measure our impact. It's good to talk about resilience and improving resilience, but how do we know if we're having an impact as a state agency? We've partnered with the University of South Carolina's Havre Lab to develop a customized resilience indicator. They're a really leader nationwide in thinking about resilience. And we've partnered with them to develop this resilience indicator for South Carolina to really see how our communities are able to handle these impacts. So you see the county map here on the right. It's using these 6 different capitals that are listed on the left. But I want to point out that this is a resilience indicator. It's not an exposure map. Clearly, Charleston and Beaufort counties have some high exposure areas. This is just the community's ability to respond and handle these. So you can see our more metro counties and areas tend to have higher resilience. Our more rural areas and folks that maybe have less resources tend to have lower resilience. So this is a very top-down way of looking at resilience. It's using publicly available data. We're currently in the process of developing a bottom-up, more qualitative metric with University of South Carolina. We think between this top-down approach of looking at resilience and then the bottom-up qualitative assessment, we'll really be able to tell over time the impact our actions are having on the resilience of communities in South Carolina, because it's really important to measure this over time. The next chapter in the plan really talks about planning conditions. Really, what's the landscape we're working with? This is a picture that most people think of when they think of South Carolina. We can think of our physiographic provinces. We've got the coastal plain system, really starting about Columbia and then going to the coast, and then above Columbia, we've got the Piedmont and a little bit of Blue Ridge in the extreme upstate. But when we're thinking about South Carolina here at the Office of Resilience, we really want to be thinking about South Carolina's hydrological footprint. So, where is all that water coming from? And you can take a look at this map and you can see that large amounts of water from North Carolina are flowing through our state. So we need to be thinking about what's happening with our neighbors in North Carolina, even up into a little bit of Virginia. We need to be thinking about what's happening on the Savannah with our neighbors in Georgia, because what happens on either side of those borders can really impact the amount of water that'll ultimately end up impacting South Carolinians. So when we're thinking about flooding, we want to kind of think outside of political boundaries and really think more on a watershed basis. We also really want to be thinking about our soils and how they help manage floodwaters, you can break soils up into really four classifications, A through D. You can think of those A-type soils as really sandy soils. Allow a lot of water to go in to infiltrate. Water will basically go straight down through those soils. The D-type soils, those are more clay-type soils, or soils that are already fully saturated. So they're just not able to take in a lot of water very quickly. So the takeaway from this is those A-type soils are really important for allowing water to enter into our groundwater system. The green area you see right in the middle of the map is a major recharge zone for most of our aquifers that supply water in the coastal plain. So if we protect those soils from being covered with impervious surface, we're allowing that water to infiltrate down rather than run off. So it's an important thing to be thinking about how our soils impact our rainfall. Our land cover as well. Certainly, if you go in and put impervious surface or pavement over high quality soils, that water no longer can infiltrate into the ground, but will run off and tends to become floodwaters. So as South Carolina develops, the increase in impervious surface can really impact how much water will be moving through our system in any given rainfall event. You think about the areas along the I-85 corridor, areas along the Charlotte metro area and along the coast is really having expanding urbanized areas. And that's going to have a real impact for how much water starts to move downstream in some of these watersheds. Because South Carolina does have a growing population. If you think about our population going back to 1790, under 500,000 people. We've been growing steadily, but it really starts to kick up in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where we just started to see a really dramatic increase in population to current populations, and that's projected to continue through 2035. And by 2035, we're starting to approach 6.5 million people in the state. But an important point is that population growth is not evenly distributed across the state. So if we look at population trends from 2010 to 2020, you can kind of see that some counties are growing very fast. Horry County in that 10-year period grew 30%, Lancaster 25%, Berkeley 29%. So some of these high growth counties are seeing just dramatic growth in a 10-year period. And then we have other areas of the state that have seen dramatic decreases in population. Allendale's population has decreased 23% in a 10-year period. If we look at population projections moving forward, so from 2020 to 2035, you can see that we have some areas of the state that just have really dramatic growth, 67% in Lancaster County, 72% in Horry County. Just going to be massive amounts of growth in the next decade and a half or so. And then we still have other areas of the state that are going to see dramatic decreases in their population. So as folks move out of the more rural areas into more urban areas, that's going to have real impact for how those communities are able to manage the existing infrastructure they have in place. So these are things we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about resilience. But the next chapter takes a look at what our climate trends look like. We need to be thinking about, on our planning horizon of 50 years or so, what does our future climate condition look like? What's the amount of rainfall we can be expecting? And the takeaway from that chapter, this chapter was developed in partnership with the University of South Carolina Geography Department, the South Carolina Climatology Office, and South Carolina Sea Grant. But the takeaway here is that we've experienced warming temperatures really starting since about the 90s to 2000s. We've kind of seen a steep uptick in our temperatures. That's projected to continue through the end of the century. So we're getting warmer. That'll certainly have an impact when we start talking about things like drought and extreme heat, but it also can impact our hydrologic cycle as well. If we look at our precipitation trends, there's no real trend on an annual basis. We're not getting continuously wetter or continuously drier on an annual basis. But what we are seeing is that when we do get rainfall, it tends to be more intense rainfall. So we had areas of the state that received, a 1,000-year event, and it's a quote 1,000-year event, 3 times in a 5-year period. So that's just an extreme amount of rainfall happening in a very short amount of time. And we see that borne out, and we look at projections for rainfall, inundation, duration, and frequency. So these are some projections from the Department of Defense. And there's a lot going on in this graphic. I recognize this is looking at Atlas 14 numbers. Atlas 14 numbers are those numbers. If you hear somebody refer to a 100-year storm or a 1,000-year storm, really what they're referring back to are these Atlas 14 numbers. And we can take a look at these and see how they're projected to change from now into the future. And the big takeaway from this graphic is for every recurrence interval, we're expecting more rainfall. And what that means is that what used to be a 100-year event, may now be a 50 or a 25-year event. So we can expect that same amount of rainfall in a much shorter frequency. Additionally, to increased precipitation intensities, we have rising sea levels. Data from NOAA. You can look at those projections there on the left. For this planning purpose, we use the intermediate to intermediate high scenario. It seems to be the most likely scenario that we're to encounter. So that's the scenario we use for planning purposes. If you think about what that means, you can look at this graph on the right, looking at observed and projected tidal flooding in Charleston. Going back to the 20s, really, since this has been measured, you start off having very low levels of tidal flooding, kind of slowly increases, but you kind of see an uptick here, since the 90s to 2000s. And in 2019, we had 89 days of tidal flooding on the peninsula. And if you look at projections, what we're looking at is that by the end of the century, we're going to have tidal flooding in Charleston pretty much every day, really twice a day with the tide. So Charleston's going to have to learn how to live with water. They have their own resilience office, and I know they're thinking about these things, but they're going to have to learn how to be able to live with water under these tidal conditions. Because in addition to rising sea levels, we're also looking at, do we have sinking land levels? So looking at land subsidence. Land subsidence can be caused by a number of different factors. It can be just natural land movement, natural compaction of the soils. It can be caused by groundwater over extraction. It can be caused by weighting of the surface from infrastructure on the surface. So there's a number of different drivers that can cause this land subsidence. And this data we're looking at is from the USGS, but this is satellite derived data. You can kind of see those rates. We're talking about very small rates of land subsidence, but they are rates. So we're talking about millimeters per year. And so over the decades, that can start to add up. It can really impact and increase the amount of flooding that we may see in some of these coastal areas. So it's important to understand what the mechanism for this is. One of the recommendations in the plan is that we install instrumentation along the coast to measure this. Currently, all this data is derived by satellite, and there's some inherent problems with doing that on the East Coast, given our humidity and vegetation cover. So we think it's important to actually get some in-ground instrumentation to measure this. The next chapter really tries to take all that information that's in the previous chapter and really start to look at what's our flood risk and vulnerability statewide, just to make sure we're all talking the same language. We're talking about flood frequencies. If we talk about a 100-year flood event, really what we're talking about is a 1% chance of flooding in any single year. But if you think about it over the course of a 30-year mortgage, that's a 26% chance that home would experience the event. So it's a pretty significant chance that you would experience it over the life of a 30-year mortgage. And also, when we're talking about floodplains, it's important to recognize that floodplains are not static things. As our flood levels increase, that the expanse of that floodplain is likely to increase as well. So a 10-year floodplain tends to be much smaller than a 500-year floodplain. It certainly can vary depending on the part of the state you're in. We do have multiple drivers of flooding in the state. We have riverine flooding. You can think of this as tends to be a little bit slower. Rainfall falls within the basin, kind of drains into the river channels, and you have those slow rising river levels. This is what we see largely in our PD area of the state. It's kind of, you usually have days, sometimes weeks to watch that water come up. We have surface and flash flooding. This tends to be much faster. This is where the drainage system, the natural and man-made drainage system, just can't handle the amount of rain that's falling in a short amount of time. And that's where we get that flash flooding. If you're familiar with the 5 Points area in Columbia, that's really what we're talking about in that type of flooding. And then coastal flooding, again, that can be either due to storm surge from a storm event, tidal flooding, and that sort of issue, but that flooding that's associated with coastal processes. And so what we wanted to do was really make sure we are trying to account for all those types of flooding. And the map we're looking at here, this is Columbia here in South Carolina. And so if you see that big red dot kind of in the middle, that is 5 Points. It's an entertainment district here in the capital, known very well for being flood prone. But the areas in blue, those are our FEMA flood maps. So if you think about the FEMA 100-year flood map or the 500-year flood map, that's those areas in the blues and purples. And importantly, those FEMA flood maps that do not capture 5 Points as a flood hazard area. But you see it identified in this data set that we acquired through the First Street Foundation. It's a nonprofit that looks at flood risk nationwide. And you can kind of see where they map flood risk that extends beyond what's mapped by FEMA. And we know that lots of these areas that are mapped do experience flooding on a fairly regular basis. And we've looked at this statewide, and we think that this mapping does a much better job of capturing what we think are true flood risks to be versus what FEMA maps in their floodplain maps. FEMA's maps only look at riverine flooding. They don't consider flash flooding, but they only look at riverine flooding, and they only look backwards. One of the benefits of using this data set for our vulnerability assessment is that in addition to looking at our current risk, our 2022 risk in this case, we can also look forward. So now we've clicked forward to 2052. So we can see how those changes in rainfall intensities can expand those areas that are subject to flooding. And I'll just click back and forth a couple times. And hopefully you can see that, we have kind of those little tributary low-lying areas expand as our rainfall gets more intense. We're going to have more housing that becomes vulnerable, housing and commercial activity that becomes vulnerable to flooding. So we've taken that data set and we can overlay it with property level data throughout the state, and we can try to get a sense for what our state's flood risk are at a statewide level. And so if we look at vulnerable properties that are vulnerable to flooding at a level 6 feet or more above the first floor elevation, so this is complete loss of a structure. You can see how those properties are distributed statewide. We have a lot of properties right along the coast. I don't think that's surprising to anybody given, coastal storm surges and that sort of thing. We have properties at risk there. But we do have properties, a large number of properties along the I-85 corridor that are also vulnerable to this type of flooding. And that's important because that area of the state just hasn't been tested the same way that the rest of the state has been. So we've had kind of widespread major rainfall events that have hit the Midlands, that have hit the PD. But that I-85 corridor, they have had some flooding events, but they haven't had anything widespread like we saw through the 2015 floods or Matthew or Florence. So it's a real concern that if we were to have a major disturbance set up and just kind of drop a whole bunch of rain along that corridor, that we could have some really substantial flooding that would impact a lot of folks. And importantly, that would be that fast flash type flooding. The soils are different, so everything is going to move a lot faster, where we may have, days or even weeks in the PD sometimes to watch that water come up. In the upstate, if we were to have that same sort of event, you're really talking about, hours at the most that you would have to prepare for that. So it's important that we start thinking about this during periods of good weather. If we look forward to 2052, you can see how that risk changes. We've added some more dots to the screen here. We've gone from about 43,000 properties statewide to 63,000 properties that are vulnerable to this 6-foot level of flooding by 2052. And that's only for existing properties. So this does not include any new properties that are built between now and then. So you can see just from changes in our rainfall patterns, we're likely to see an increase in risk over time. If we think about properties that have any level of risk of flooding, so this is, any amount of water that would come into the first floor elevation, you can see how that map changes. It becomes dramatically redder, and it's really a statewide problem. We see lots of homes that are vulnerable. And if you take it forward to 2052, you really go from about 306,000 properties statewide to 340,000 properties statewide that are at risk from a 100-year event. So that's just there to let you know that we do have quite a number of properties already that are vulnerable, and that's why it's really important that we start planning for the future as we're building new developments and new economic growth as South Carolina develops. We want to make sure we're placing that in areas that are appropriate, so we're not making our problems worse. We want to kind of quit digging the hole and really start to think a little bit better about where we're putting folks to make sure we're not putting them in harm's way. In addition to kind of parcel level data, we also wanted to look at some other types of facilities that can have issues if they're flooded. So there's a whole series of maps in the report that look at a lot of different state level data sets and how they interact with that First Street data layer. And here's just a few examples. One is looking at solid waste facilities. Obviously, that's important. If you flood a solid waste facility, there's the chance of mobilizing contaminants into the sediments that would move downstream and could cause a problem for folks. So we can see how that's distributed statewide. We do have a number that are in flood-prone areas, and that number does increase as we go through time. Substations, thinking about the power grid. Again, substations are probably the most vulnerable part of the power grid to flooding, and you can see how that risk changes over time. I will let you know that the utilities are, they're very aware of these risks and how they're changing, and they are taking steps to start to armor some of these systems to make sure that they're able to handle these types of events. Looking at our road network, this is a map from Dillon County. This was a preliminary map that we made looking at how the DOT road network interacts with that flood layer data, and then trying to map those areas of the road network that may be subject to flooding during a 100-year event. And you kind of see that map there with how that's distributed. We think that'll be important for both emergency response activities, but also long-term planning for transportation infrastructure. If there's areas that we need to elevate or raise or make less prone to flooding, this will help us identify those areas and prioritize them. Switching over to kind of commercial losses, thinking about our economy and how flooding can impact our economy. We can estimate the average number of days lost based on the flooding level, and you can see the map here, the red map on the left. This is the average days lost for each small watershed statewide, and you can see that those numbers go up to about 140 to 242 days lost from a 100-year event. Estimated, and then based on that data, you can estimate the economic, the dollar value associated with that, and you're talking about $100 million to $1.6 billion in some of these watersheds. So it can be a real large financial impact when folks can't get to work and commercial activity shut down. And so it's just important to recognize that it's both the communities that can be impacted, but also our economy can be impacted long-term by failure to plan appropriately. Another economic driver for South Carolina is agriculture. We can look at our agricultural lands that may be subject to flooding. Here we're looking at acreage per small watershed, and you see how that's distributed across the state, largely in our PD and coastal plain areas where we have a lot of agricultural activity. It's important to note that a lot of this depends on when that water comes through. Flooding outside the growing season is likely to have less economic impact than a flood that would happen during the growing season. And it also depends on the type of crop that's planted, whether or not it can handle being inundated for large periods of time. So there's a lot of variables that go into trying to calculate what the impact to agriculture is. And that's something we'll be working to expand upon in future versions of the report, is trying to put a little bit more dollars behind what that looks like. We also want to think about those cultural resources that are important to us. So there's a series of maps that look at cultural assets across the state. This example here is just from the National Register of Historic Places. You can see the number of sites for each little watershed that may be subject to a 100-year event and how that changes over time as well. So there's a whole series of maps looking at cultural resources in the plan. And then our military installations, obviously an important aspect of South Carolina's economy. This is the Marine Corps Air Station Buford and Marine Corps Depot at Parris Island. You can see how that flood risk looks. This is the 2052 map. I will say that the Department of Defense is very aware of what their flood risks are, both now and in the future, and they're being very proactive in preparing these sites for future conditions. There's a lot of dollars being put into these facilities in both green and gray infrastructure to prepare them for future conditions, but they're really taking advantage of trying to bolster the natural systems around these facilities to offer natural protection. And then finally, on the vulnerability side, we want to make sure that we understand that flooding and disasters impact different folks differently. So a person's resources often determines their ability to recover from an event. So this map here, we're looking at flood exposure and then combined with social vulnerability. And so you can start to map out those areas of the state where we have both the high risk of flood and the high social vulnerability. And these are areas of the state that, as the state agency, we need to be paying particular attention to, because the local communities may not have the resources to self-recover. So that's a place for the state to come in and really assist these communities. And you can see how that's distributed. Again, it's largely in those more rural sections of the state where we had the dwindling populations. If you think back to the earlier slides, they also had the lowest resilience metrics from our resilience vulnerability. So there's a lot of things that are pointing to our agency that those are the kind of the areas we may need to focus some extra attention on to make sure that those folks are prepared. Okay, the next chapter of the plan really focuses on kind of other hazards. Again, the bulk of this report focuses on our flooding hazard, but we did think it was important to kind of give a brief overview of some of the other hazards that South Carolina faces. And these are hazards that we'll be expanding upon in future versions of the plan. But just a brief overview of those. One is wildfire. Certainly out west, it gets a lot of attention, but we do have some potential for wildfire here in South Carolina. So it's important to be thinking about our forestry practices and that wildland urban interface and how we're monitoring those. But you can see how that risk profile is distributed here on these maps. Drought, kind of the flip side of flood. You can see how that looks from our risk index from FEMA, driven largely by the agricultural sector here. You can see how the PD area has a higher risk rating, and that's due to their reliance on agricultural economy. Our heat wave, that's largely a statewide problem where we could have extreme heat issues. Urban heat can be an issue. So there's several projects looking at urban heat in our metro areas. So you see Columbia here on the left, Charleston on the right, and how that heat can vary across metro areas. And that's important because, again, that tends to not be evenly distributed based on economic factors. So it tends to be more disadvantaged communities often have the highest heat burden. So it's important to understand that and then think about those processes and policies that we may be able to implement down the road to help alleviate that. Other risk, lightning, tornado, strong winds. Again, those are statewide. Early indications may be that some of that can increase as we in our future climate conditions as we kind of get more intense storm events. Our hurricane risk, you can see how that's largely along our coast. And then our winter weather, kind of the extreme northern portions of the state. And then maybe one that's kind of underappreciated in South Carolina is earthquakes. We did have the largest earthquake on the East Coast in Charleston. So it's important to think about, with that earthquake hazard. And you can see that FEMA ranks us relatively high to very high in the Charleston area for our earthquake risk index. The next chapter, now that we've kind of looked at our risk and hazards, we wanted to take a look at how processes currently work in South Carolina before we made any recommendations. And so this chapter really focuses on just what are those current processes within South Carolina. It looks at things like land use planning regulations, hazard mitigation planning, state water planning, and other planning efforts statewide, property disclosures, how data is currently managed statewide. We start thinking about things like stormwater management regulations and design, green stormwater design, building codes, that sort of thing, things that help us absorb these impacts. We also take a look at current recovery frameworks and state coordination of recovery. And then we take a little section to try to identify those co-benefits to all these processes. If we put land under conservation for mitigating flood, identifying that there's also economic and community benefits as well. And just a couple examples out of that chapter. First one's looking at stormwater infrastructure design. So we're looking at a table here from DOT, looking at how some of the DOT drainage is designed. A lot of it's designed to a 10 or 25-year storm. I think it's maybe important to start thinking about if these are drainage features that are protecting kind of critical corridors, it may be worth looking at, do we move to a more risk-based design, building them for maybe a 50 or 100-year storm based on the criticality of the area. Because again, we are anticipating those frequencies to change, thinking back to our Atlas 14 numbers. Our building codes, we can think about how our building codes look. Our building codes are pretty good in South Carolina. We've done a good job of continually updating our building codes, which is important for making sure we have a resilient housing stock and commercial building stock. But there are a couple of areas for improvement. The first being the hurricane code. You can see the counties on the yellow, on the left there in yellow that have adopted a weakened or older code, but maybe should be adopting the full code for hurricane, because we do obviously face hurricane threats in the state. And then the seismic code for the counties in yellow on the right. Again, Charleston, well known for its earthquake risk, and we think it would make sense for those counties to adopt the full code for seismic in that area. A relatively new one, protection of wetlands. There was a recent Supreme Court decision that changed which wetlands were regulated under the Clean Water Act. The important thing here is that we have, you see kind of the graphic on the left. This is from researcher at Clemson, looking at how this has changed over time. And then the graphic on the right, we've done a very preliminary evaluation of the number, the acreage of wetlands we think are now vulnerable, that have no state or federal protection. So they would be vulnerable to development. You can see that visualization there, largely in our coastal plain areas. A lot of these wetlands, Carolina Bays, those sorts of things that are no longer protected at the federal level, and there's no state level protections. So one of the recommendations in the plan is that the state needs to take a look at, do we need a state level protection for these wetlands? Because these wetlands do offer a high level of flood protection for our communities downstream. And if we go in and modify too much of this wetland system, it's likely to really impact the amount of flood waters that move downstream and can put life and property at risk down the road. The next chapter really focuses on funding and how a lot of this stuff runs through the state. It's just a real simplified graphic of just two federal agencies and how that money flows down through the state, FEMA and HUD. You'd see FEMA money largely flows to our EMD through the Hazard Mitigation Program or the BRIC program. Some of that money goes to FMA through our Department of Natural Resources, and then some HUD dollars for resilience come through HUD to our office. And so, yeah, this is kind of simple, but as you start to add on different federal agencies, EPA, NOAA, economic development, there's a whole alphabet soup of federal agencies. And as you start to add those on, they each have their own individual programs within each agency. And it starts to build a real complicated web for how funding can move from the federal level to the state level. And we're working to try to identify all those pathways and really try to maximize the amount of money that South Carolina can bring down from federal dollars. If we're going to spend the federal dollars, we think those dollars should be coming to South Carolina because they're going to get spent anyway. So we want to maximize as much of those dollars coming to South Carolina as possible. In addition to thinking about how federal money moves down, we did have some state dollars that were set up with the creation of our office. We have a reserve fund that was initially capitalized with $44 million. It had $200 million that were added in the last fiscal year. So it sounds like a lot of money, but when you start thinking about what the scope of this fund is intended to do, it's not so much money. It's really intended to be there for both pre-disaster programs. So this is doing hazard mitigation and infrastructure projects, buyouts and land acquisitions of some critical lands, but also be available to do post-disaster programs. So to be able to really kickstart disaster recovery in the event of a major disaster. And that's doing things like providing that non-federal share for federal disaster and really just kind of getting things going very quickly and supporting disaster case management efforts to jumpstart disaster recovery. We're also using that fund to fund a disaster reserve corps, and this is a group of individuals who are hired on at the state. So they're kind of part-time. You can think of kind of reserve folks. They come on, we train them up, and then in the event of a disaster, they're able to be deployed very quickly and get to communities very quickly. And we think that's really going to have a major impact when we start thinking about disaster recovery and speeding those resources to folks. We also have a revolving loan fund that was set up with $6 million initially capitalized. That's to do low interest loans to do voluntary home buyouts and floodplain restoration projects. So if this is a local unit of government or local community has an interest in either one of these projects, they can get a very low interest loan. And then this is set up to be a revolving loan fund. So as those funds are paid back into the loan, they then become available down the road in the future for additional projects. So if anybody has interest in those, I encourage y'all to reach out and we'll be happy to get you in touch with the appropriate folks to talk about accessing those funds. Okay, the last chapter in the plan really looks at recommendations. And there's 54 individual recommendations in the plan, and I won't go through them all. You can really break them out into 10 major themes. The first is that we need to improve our data collection and coordination. We collect a lot of data in the state, but there's definitely room for improvement. We have gaps in our river gauge network. We need additional weather monitoring stations. We need to monitor for land subsidence, that sort of thing. And then we also need to coordinate that data better. So there's a lot of state data sets that exist, but there's no one repository where somebody could go in and say, all right, what data does South Carolina keep and maintain, and who has, and where would I go for that data? So that's a project we're currently working on. We did receive some funding from the legislature this past session to start that process and really starting to build that catalog of what data South Carolina actually has, so we can maximize its use and minimize costs down the road. Working to increase education, outreach, and disclosure. That's through education, things like this, working with local communities. Disclosure, thinking about land transaction, real estate transaction form disclosures. There were some recommendations in the report to strengthen those, to make it so that folks that are buying property have a true understanding of their flood risk. Coordinating watershed-based resilience planning and projects. This is something we're working on currently, working to hire watershed coordinators. This will be to help coordinate resilience planning at the local level. So really working with communities to help develop their own local resilience elements for their comprehensive plans, but also other land use plans and that sort of thing. And incorporating them into a larger watershed-based plan that will ultimately feed up into the update of this resilience plan. We recognize that resilience largely has to happen at the local level, and we want to provide those resources to localities so that they can make the decisions that are best for them. As part of this, we've worked with the First Street Foundation to make that First Street data set available to all units of state government and local governments. So as localities are starting to think about resilience, they can look at the same data sets we are. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to let you know how to get the access to that data. Working to incorporate resilience into planning, land use, and other processes. Again, this is working with local governments, but also our other state government agencies, our sister agencies, to incorporate some of this into the regulatory processes. So it just kind of becomes part of the day-to-day activities of South Carolina. I already talked about building codes. It's important to stay on that updated building code schedule, making sure we're maintaining that and then strengthening those portions of the code that we think need to be strengthened. Incorporating resilience into our infrastructure design. I talked about that a little bit already, making sure we're designing our infrastructure for the intended life of that structure. So if we're building a bridge to be around 100 years from now, we need to design it for the conditions that are going to exist 100 years from now, not the conditions that existed 20 years ago. Working to maintain natural flood protection through conservation. I'm going to skip to one slide, talk about this one. We think that conservation is a very important part of resilience. These systems offer a lot of natural benefit to us already. And as South Carolina is growing, we do have an opportunity still to preserve some of these critical areas so that we're not having to deal with the consequences of them being developed down the road. And so what we've done is we've mapped out those areas of the state that we think are important for conservation from a purely flooding perspective. And that's looking at things, we've taken the flood hazard areas, we've looked at areas where marsh migration is going to happen as sea levels rise. We've incorporated areas that are currently wetlands and also added in those best infiltration areas statewide where water is allowed to go into our deeper groundwater system. And you can see an example of the maps that were created. This one is the South Fork of the Edisto. And so you can see those areas where we think conservation should be a priority to help reduce the impacts of flooding. And you can also flip that map and say, all right, those areas that are not in the green areas, those are areas that maybe if we are targeting development or expansion of development that we should look at, developing in appropriate areas versus areas that may cause us problems down the road. Incorporating resilience into housing recovery through our work as the Disaster Recovery Office, we've identified some areas for improvement. Those have all been adopted by internal memo by our Chief Resilience Officer, Ben Duncan. So all those recommendations will be part of future housing recoveries going forward. But that's things like using more stick-built homes, using impact resistant windows, better roofing standards, that sort of thing. Establishing a voluntary pre-disaster buyout program. As shown in the previous maps, we do have a large number of structures that are vulnerable currently to flooding. We think it would make sense to start to offer some voluntary buyouts for the most vulnerable of those folks. Little side note on buyout programs, they're very complicated. You really have to have buy-in from the local community. It's not just buying people out. You also have to understand where those people could go, how that's going to impact the community. So any buyout program that's developed would need to have strong community buy-in. And again, it would be completely voluntary, but we do think that's worth looking at a statewide level. And then finally, we need to identify and maximize all available funding sources for resilience activities. We're working on that now, trying to identify all those different federal dollars that we can seek to bring into South Carolina for resilience activities. There's a lot of money that's kind of out there right now, and we're working as hard as we can to bring as much of those dollars to South Carolina as possible. So with that, I think we can take some questions. I encourage you to either drop it in the chat or maybe raise your hand, and I will call on you. Just try to keep it orderly. But before we take questions, I do want to thank everybody for being here today. It's important that we spread this word about what's in the plan and where we're going as an agency. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions, I encourage y'all to follow us on all the social medias. Check out our webpage. We do have a newsletter that you can sign up for to keep tabs on what we're working on, both now and in the future. And if anybody would like to reach out to us, I encourage you to do so. And we look forward to working with many of you in the future.